Angular 4 is one of the most popular frameworks that can be used to create single-page web applications. These only require you to download a single HTML file and then will update dynamically as the user interacts with the application. Now, this is the second video in our tutorial series on Angular 4, and just in case you missed it, in our first tutorial I introduced you to the core concepts of Angular, and I showed you how to work with the framework, creating your first component, and how to set up your routes, and generally how to use Angular. If you didn't watch that tutorial, then I do encourage you to go back and watch that tutorial first before you begin watching this one, because it's going to give you the foundation and the knowledge to take in everything that you see in this video, which is going to be a slightly more advanced level. I will be putting a link in the description of this video, but alternatively you can visit our channel and search for the video yourself. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to be using our first API. And the API that I've chosen to use in this tutorial is from Pixabay, which is an image library. It's a free, royalty-free stock library that is actually a really great website in case you haven't heard about it. Now, one of the biggest problems that you might have when you're building a website is actually how you can find the right images, because imagery is really important when you're creating websites these days, when you're trying to convey a message or just make it visually more pleasing. And sometimes it's really hard to find, making this a really great resource. Because let me give you an example. If I just search for a keyword like lion and I do a search, I can find any of these images. I can click on any of them and download them for free, and actually really a high-res copy of the image. And this is completely free to use within your own projects. And just so you know, I'm not connected or affiliated with this website in any way whatsoever, but I actually use this service myself. Now that you know what Pixabay is, like I said, we're going to be using the API that they provide, which if you come to the footer of their website, you can just come down here and click on API. And when you do that, you're going to find that basically what an API is, in case you're not familiar. An API basically allows us to access a service, and usually in this case, we're going to be able to use an API to, in the background of our own website, access Pixabay and actually kind of take their images from their server and their database and actually kind of show them on our website as if they were, on our server, which they're not, but they're just coming through an API. So for example, you could use an API on YouTube and you can show a video playlist on your website, and just theme it up yourself. I mean, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but hopefully that all makes sense. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that I'm going to be using Angular's CLI to basically create and set up our project. If you're not familiar with that, then I really encourage you to visit Angular's the Angular IO website. And again, I'll put a link in the description of this video. But in case you're not familiar, the CLI Quick Start is basically something that you can use through Terminal or CMD, but it basically is just a package. It's like a plugin that you can use to just create your applications really easily. And I'm going to show you what this is in a really short time. However, to use this, you need to use NPM, which is Node Package Manager, it actually comes bundled in with Node.js. So again, I'll put a link in the description to this, and I'm going to kind of explain all of this a little bit more as we get into the tutorial, but I just want to give you an overview. You will need to come over to the Node.js website and just download and install a version of Node.js. And as I said, we need NPM, which is bundled in with Node. Okay, so this is where the fun begins. We're going to actually start coding this up. Now, as I kind of just explained, you're going to need to install Node because we're going to be using NPM during this tutorial to basically set up and use our application. So assuming that you have gone ahead and downloaded and installed Node on your machine, I'm just going to close this and we're not going to talk about that anymore. I'm going to open up a terminal window and I'm going to navigate to my desktop. So I'm just going to say cd desktop. And as you can see here, I'm on desktop within my terminal window, and I'm just going to say mkdir, and I'm going to call this project something like Angular tutorial, something like that. And you can see what I've done is I've just created a folder on my desktop. So this is, I guess, it's just an easier way for me to create a folder just through terminal. But if I don't want to confuse anybody, you can absolutely just create a new folder in your documents or your desktop, wherever you want, and it's exactly the same as what I just did. So I'm going to clear that down, but again, all I've done is I've just created a folder on my desktop. There's nothing in it, it's empty. So what I want to do now is kind of what I talked about before. I've already gone ahead and installed Node. I have that on my system. But I want to use Angular CLI, which is basically a plugin that they've provided through NPM that can be used to really easily create Angular projects and applications. Before you can use Angular CLI, you need to install it globally on your machine, the same way that you did Node. The way that you install it is actually, you just take this line, and again, I've been referencing NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager, and that's why we installed Node, because we're going to be using it heavily. And once you start working with Angular or React, or pretty much, just web development, you're going to find that the more advanced level that you get to, as you learn more and more, you're going to be using Terminal and NPM and Node more and more. So it's a great it's a great thing to learn and to be comfortable with. So I've already installed it, but literally all you have to do is take this line, copy it into your terminal window or your CMD if you're on Windows, and just run that and it'll install for you. It might take a few minutes, but it will run for you. And all this means here is NPM stands for Node Package Manager. Obviously, install just means you're installing something. G means that you're installing it globally, and this is actually what we're installing. So it's just Angular CLI. So now that we have installed that, and as I said, I already have, you can use that plugin to basically set up your project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to this folder that I just created. So in my terminal window, I'm going to say cd, and I'm just going to drag this folder into my terminal. It puts that path. I'm just going to click on return, and you can see I'm now inside that folder. Now what I want to do is I want to use Angular CLI to create my Angular project. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say ng new and the name of the application. So maybe I'll just say that this is my my project, but you can call it anything that you want. Just going to click on return, and it's going to take a few minutes, so I'm going to probably pause this video and come back to it, but it's going to go ahead and just create that project for me. Okay, so I've literally just paused the video and let that kind of install all of the packages and dependencies, modules that I need. And I've come back because that's now finished. So I literally haven't done anything. It's just basically telling me that the project's been created successfully. So again, if I look at the folder, I called that project, and that's now here. So I can click into that, and you can see this is the project that I've created. So this is what I need. So what I need to do to actually run this is I need to navigate into the project folder. So in my terminal window, let's just clear that down so it's a little bit easier to work with. And let's just say cd and drag this project folder in. I'm now inside my project folder. And I'm just going to say ng serve. Not server, what am I doing? Serve open. And that's just going to launch my testing server, my light testing server. And we're going to actually see that we have our application set up. And there you go. So that's popped up in Safari, which I guess is just my default browser. I don't like Safari for web development, so I'm just going to copy the URL and I'm going to come back over to Chrome and I'm going to just put that in. And there you can see that there's my app. So now this is not a tutorial for learning Angular or learning how to use Angular CLI or anything like that. But it's just a basic foundation that I like to do in my tutorials, just to kind of go over things and make sure that everybody is able to keep up and is working with the same tools. And it just makes it a little bit easier to follow along with. But as I said, if you're interested in learning more of the fundamentals of Angular, please look at the link in the description. Go to our previous video in this series and watch that, and then return to this one. But let's get going with this tutorial. So I'm going to be using Sublime Text as my text editor, and I'm just going to drag this folder here, my project folder, into Sublime, and that's just going to allow me to work with these files a little bit better. I'm going to move this over. I'm going to swap these to either side. And there you go. So what we want to do is, I guess I just want to open up these project folders. If I go into the source folder and go into the app folder, and you're going to see these are the main files that I have. So obviously, if you watch our previous video, you'll be familiar with our modules file, our first TS file, which stands for TypeScript, by the way. And then, of course, we have our CSS and HTML. I'm actually going to delete these two files. So I'm just going to delete that file, and I'm going to delete this file. And I'm just going to come back here to, obviously it's going to error, but I'm going to come to this main app component. And just for the ease of this tutorial, I'm going to remove template URL. I'm just going to say template. And I'm just going to put everything in line, basically. So I'm going to put all that in line. And styles, I guess I'll probably put that in line as well. But I kind of don't want to do it this way. I probably would prefer to just have a separate CSS file included. So I'm just going to save that, and that should then just fix it. But again, there's no HTML in there now. So if I just put in like something like a H1, so let's just put a H1 in. And just say hello world. Save it. You're going to see, I mean, that's updating in real time because it's got browser sync, but you're going to see, again, this is not the aim of the tutorial. The tutorial, I'm not trying to show you how to kind of work with Angular. I'm just going to get back into the API stuff. So again, what I said previously about this API that we're going to be using, we're going to basically be setting this up so we can search for images provided by Pixabay, search the database, but search on our website. So I'm going to delete this. We don't really need that. And I'm just going to just make a few lines so we have some space to work with. And we're going to get into it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate over to my modules file, my modules TS file. And I'm just going to specify that this is JavaScript so we get the correct syntax highlighting, I guess. So I'll just do that. And the first thing that we want to do, I guess, is come over to our modules TS. And I just want to say that we're going to need to access the API. So I'm going to actually set that component in my providers. And also, I just want to note that I have my HTTP module imported here from Angular HTTP, and that's actually quite important. If I take this line here, I'm just going to copy it, and I'm going to come back over to my main app component TS, and we need to import a few other things. So the first thing that we're going to import from Angular HTTP is HTTP, and we're also going to import response. And the other thing that we need to import is we're going to be using what's known as the map function. And that's basically going to allow us to phrase everything in JSON. But I'm going to cover that a little bit further when we get into the tutorial. So RxJS add operator and map. So these are the imports that we require to actually use the API. But again, I'm going to kind of get back to that a little bit later. So we need to create a few things here. So I guess I'm going to kind of assume that you're familiar with using APIs, but again, I guess I'll try and explain it as much as possible as we go. So the first thing that we're going to do is, if I come down here, you're going to see that what we get is we get this, what's known as an endpoint. So basically what this is it's a URL, and if I just take this URL and I put this in my web browser, you're going to find that I'll probably just get an error. Okay, the reason that I'm getting an error is because it requires a few more parameters on the URL. So the most important one is we need to specify our key, which I'm going to copy here. This is my key. To get this key, you need to be registered with Pixabay. You need to log into their website, and then you'll see that you have a key here which you can use. Now I'm going to come back over to my my other tab, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that as a parameter to the URL. So to do that, I just put a question mark and I specify key equals, and I put in the key that I have. And you're going to see that I'm not getting an error anymore. And the reason is that I have to authenticate myself. I have to say that I have permission to access and use this API. Now, it does get a little bit more complicated than that. This is actually a very good API. Sometimes the APIs that you might be working with are not as easy as this one to use. But as you know, for this tutorial and as an example, this is actually a really good example to start working with. So as you can see, what this is basically just one big object. And I'm going to explain what all this is a little bit more as we get into the tutorial. But we need to kind of narrow this down and specify what we actually want. So far, we've just told the API that we have permission to get data from you. We now need to show them, we now need to tell them what we want. So to do that, I'm going to come back over to the documentation, and you're going to see that we have a few parameters. And these parameters allow us to pass through information about what we want in return. So I think the most important one here, and it's been a while since I've actually used this, is Q. And what Q is basically just a query. It's like a search term. So if I come back over to my API example and I put on, now this is the second parameter in the URL. So I don't put another question mark. I just go to the end of it. I put an and I paste, well, I say Q, which is the name of the parameter, and I put equals, and I specify a term. So if I put in here a lion, as we did previously, you're going to see that everything kind of reloaded. I can see a few keywords here. So there's lion. But again, this is kind of difficult to understand. Let me come over and actually use another parameter. I'm just going to say, you know, I know what the parameter name is. It's called pretty. That's going to equal true. And this is kind of, well, this is much, much more readable, but I think this is going to make a lot more sense now. So what pretty does is it just kind of, well, it just puts everything in, you know, correct formatting. Previously it was definitely not. It was kind of a minified version. But what this is this is an object. And an object basically just contains properties. So for example, this is a property which contains another object. And as you can see here, this is kind of the data and the response that we want. So for example here, if I take this preview URL, this is an image library, and the API is allowing us to search their database of images. So I can take this preview URL here, If I come over to another tab and I put in that URL, you're going to see it's a small image of a line. If I come back here, there should be another one, page URL, web format URL. That might be the one. So as you can see, I don't use this API all the time. Okay, so this is a bigger version of that image. So this might be the one you'd want to use. If I come back here, it even gives us the ID. This is the user. So if I put in this, it will give me the uploader, the user's profile pic. If I come here, it even has the page URL. So if I take that page URL, you're going to see that if I put that here, that's the page on Pixabay. Let's come back here, I guess. And I just want to show you. So again, I have this query. This is my search term. And if I just change that from line, let's say I want to say USA, click on return, I'm going to get images that are associated with the USA. So if I take that URL and I put that here, okay, so that's kind of an American flag. Okay, so again, you can kind of specify more of what you want. As you can see, if I put cat, there's going to be pictures of cats. So you can see how we're using the API now, and there's tons and tons of parameters that you can use here that will allow you to kind of break this down even further. And obviously every API will have its own unique parameters, but that should give you a really good understanding about what an API is and how you can use it. And I can obviously just test this out in my web browser. Another popular way of doing that is something called Postman. And if you get more into APIs, I'm sure you're going to hear that that term. A really good tool to actually work with when you're working with APIs to run tests and stuff like that. But getting back to this tutorial, how can we incorporate this API into our Angular application? Well, let's take this. So let's come back over here to our web browser, and let's take this URL. I'm just going to literally copy that out, and I'm going to close that tab. And if I come back here, we want to assign that URL to a variable, and I'm actually going to set that variable to private. So if I just do private, and I'm going to call this my API URL, and it's going to equal a string, and that is just literally going to be the URL that I had in my web browser just a few moments ago. I'm also going to create a data variable, and I'm actually going to set this to any, and I'll explain what that is in just a second, and that's just going to equal an empty object. So if you're not familiar with a variable with this colon and any, what that basically it's just an extra, I guess it's just an extra, how would I describe that? It basically tells JavaScript that this variable can contain anything from a Boolean to a string to a number, anything at all. And in this case, we've just created an empty object, which is basically JSON. And I've done that by just creating two opening and closing curly braces. The next thing that you will need to do, if you're familiar with Angular, is we need to create our constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And in our constructor, we need to do a few things. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to inject the HTTP service. So to do that, again, I'm going to say private HTTP and then HTTP. And we're going to do a few things here. But what I'm going to do is just to show you that it's working, is if I do a console log of something, let's say hello world. And let's come back over here. Let's go to inspect element and go to our console. and you're going to see here that we have hello world. So we know that that is working. And then what we need to do is actually we need to create two methods. Okay, so now we're ready to actually go ahead and actually write the methods that are going to actually go out and actually communicate with that API. So the first method that we're going to create is going to be called get data. Okay, and the way that we define a method is like this. It's in our export class of the component, and obviously we just specify the name and then opening and closing curly braces. And then what we want to do is we want to return, and what we want to do is we want to make our HTTP GET request. So to do that, we'll say this.http.get, and we want to put in here this.our API URL. Now, if you're not sure what that is, yep, that's the private variable that we created that just contains the string, which is our API and our URL to get that data. Now we also imported that map function, which is what we're going to use here to specify that when we get that response, we want that in JSON. So we're going to say map, and then we're going to just say that we want to create a variable. Let's call it res, and that's going to contain our response. And then what we want to do is we want to return that in JSON. Okay, so now that we have that, what we want to do is we want to create our second method. So we're going to say get images, and we're going to define that method pretty much the same way, but what we want to do is we want to say this dot get data, which is that method that we just created, and we want to subscribe to it. Okay, and I'll explain what that is in just a second, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say subscribe, and what that is going to contain is data. And data is basically, you can view that as like a success event. So what I can actually do is I can say console.log data, and if I save it, nothing's going to happen because we haven't initialized this. So I'm going to come back over to my constructor, and I'm going to initialize it by just saying, if I put it here, this dot get data and this dot get images. And if I save that, you're going to see that in my console, because I'm console logging data, you're going to see that just as we saw it on our page previously when I put this into my browser, the tab that I closed, this is the same, but it's just in my console. So again, this is an object, this is a property, as you can see, which contains an array, which contains objects. And those objects contain, you know, all the information that we're trying to receive from our API. So we've kind of covered the JavaScript side of how we can set this up to work with our API. But how can we actually do something and kind of spit this out onto a web page? We've done the JavaScript part of this, where we've actually gone out and made a GET request, got that response. At the moment, all we can see is in our console, we can see that we have this object, right? So we want to actually do something with that. So I want to basically loop through that array, and I want to show the image from each one of those. So how can I actually do that? So coming over to this template section of my component, so this is the HTML part, and I'm going to create an unordered list, okay? And you can, it doesn't have to be an unordered list, it can be any kind of HTML structure that you want. That's completely up to you. So I'm just going to create one list item, and basically within this list item, what I want to have is my image. But how can I actually do that? So what I do is I'm going to loop through it using ng4, and I'll just say equals let image, and image would refer to this iteration, so image of, and then that data variable that we basically assigned all of our response to. So I created that data variable, if you remember, And then basically when I subscribed to the get data method, I basically pushed all of that data into that variable. So I want to basically say image of data, but then I don't want to just say data. I want to specify that I want everything inside of the hits property. So basically that hits property contains an array which has all of those images in it. So I want to specify hits, which is the name of the property that I'm targeting. Now that I have that, I can look inside of each one of these objects and I can specify exactly what I want from here. So this couldn't be any easier. So for example, if I wanted to do this, all I would have to do is create my image tag, open, closing, specify the source, and the source would just be dynamic, and that would basically be this, same as I showed you previously in the web browser. I think it's the web format URL, I might be wrong. I think I'm right. And all I would do is I would target this iteration. So again, I would say image dot and then the name of what I want, which is that image. And as you can see, because it's using browser sync, it's updating in real time, you can see that that's what I have. I have all of the images coming through that API, and that's showing on my web page. So what about if I wanted to do something a little bit cooler? I could literally grab anything here. So for example, if I come into it, you can see that I know the number of likes. So if I wanted to, I could create a span class of whatever I want. So let's say likes. And I could specify strong. And this could just be something like likes. And then I would just, again, I would just say image dot likes. And then in each one, as it loops through, you're going to see that I have the number of likes for each image. I could come back here again, and I could literally pull through anything that I want from this API. So the user, the tags, etc. I could even link. So for example, if I wanted to, I could create a link. So if I create an anchor tag, I create a href. Let's just put a hashtag in there now. And let's wrap, I guess let's wrap the image. The image is enough for that. And I want to wrap that. But then I want to take the page URL. So if I copy the page URL, and then in here, in the href, I would target it. I would say image and page URL. And again, that would update. Now if I click on this, before I click on that, I just want to specify the target. Blank. So basically, now if I click on any one of these images, so if I click on this one, there you go. I get that picture on Pixabay. If I click on this one, I get this picture on Pixabay. Okay, so at this point what we've done is we've actually used the API to actually create everything that we want. But it doesn't look that great. So I just want to show you how we can actually, I guess, take this to the next level and incorporate something that, you know, something like Bootstrap to make this look good. So how can we do that? Let's come over to Bootstrap. And if I just click on, spelled that wrong, forgive me, getting started, and let's find that link to the CDN. So this is the minified Bootstrap link. Let's come back over to, so obviously you can specify the CSS for just this component. I don't think that makes sense. I'm not going to get into why. I just like to go to my main index file. I guess it depends what you're doing and how you're creating it. But for me, this is going to work fine. So I'm going to include Bootstrap on this level, and then I'm also going to basically create my own style sheet, which I'll put into assets. So I'm just going to come over to new file, and I'm going to save this, and I'm going to call this my default.css. Okay, And I'm just going to literally go over to my index file and click on return, click on, well, say link, href, and I think it's in assets / I think it's just default.css, and then I'm just going to say real style sheet, and type is going to be text CSS, and we'll save it. And you won't see much here, but if I come back over to this CSS, I can start doing stuff. So for example, if we just quickly run over to something like Google Fonts, and I grab hold of Google Fonts, let's do a quick search, or maybe I'll just use Open Sans. Let's click on that, select this font, expand this real quick, customize, regular, bold, click on embed. Let's take this link to the style sheet and let's put this into our index file as well, just before default CSS. We'll save that and come back to default CSS, and then we'll take this, and I'm just going to define the body, and on the body I'm just going to add that font, and I'm going to say font size something like 18 pixels, and the color can just be black. Now I would never normally write standard CSS, I would go down the Sass route, but for this tutorial, this is just going to be super quick and easy for me to just do it this way. But just to show you that it's working, if I took something like a nice light, sort of, let's just do like a light gray. So if I say something like 90, 90, 90, and if I come back over to my project, I got a gray background. Might be a little dark, but I'm just giving you guys an example. Let's come back over to our app component. I don't want this in a unordered list anymore. I think it would work better just as a div, and I'll explain why in a second, but I'm going to change this to a div, and I just want the images, I guess, at this point, so I'm going to get rid of that span, but that's fine for the images and them being in links. Yeah, that'll be fine. So if I come over to Bootstrap and you look at the CSS or the getting started, you're going to see that they have, I don't know if, I'm assuming that you would have used this before, but let's go over to the CSS, and they've got some cool stuff here. I'm going to use the fluid container. I'm going to use this to wrap all this in here. And I'll tab that in, but then I'll target this, and I'll come back over to my CSS, and I'll set a max width of something like 1366, and a margin right and left of auto, and maybe even put in 100 pixels or something from the top and bottom. So what I have here so far, once that loads, so I guess all I want to do now is just float this across maybe like two in a row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my CSS, and I'm going to, well, no, I'll come to Bootstrap, and if I just take that class, let's say, the way that Bootstrap works. So I'm going to add a class to this div. And this is the advantage of Bootstrap, I guess, because it just makes it so easy. So that would be a 6, because Bootstrap works on a 6 column grid. Oh, and I forgot the row. So I need row as well. So hopefully this is all making sense, but you can kind of follow along. This isn't the aim of the tutorial. The aim of the tutorial is just to show you what's possible. And here I'm just going to say image. So the reason that this is broken is simple. I'm going to explain why in a second. I'm just going to target image here in my CSS, and I'm going to set a height something like maybe maybe I'll say 450, something like that. And I'm going to hide the overflow. And I'm going to set a margin bottom of 20 pixels, which should look good. And I'm just going to specify the actual image itself. I'm going to set this to position absolute, so the parent will need to be relative. And I'm just going to say top 50%, left 50%, and then I want to transform and translate, not Y. It'll be minus 50% here and then minus 50%, so that's both axes. I got to put in my browser support, so that's WebKit, Moz. That should do it. And I'm just going to make sure that the height is, well, let's say the min height is 100%, and just see what that does. So that should resolve that issue. Looks about right. There's an issue here. I'm not sure why, because that shouldn't be. I think I need another wrapper. Image here. I'm going to create another div with a class here. And I'm going to say this is wrap. And I'm going to save it, come back here. Let's say image.wrap position relative width 100%. And also height 100%. That should do it. Okay, so that should be it. I'm still getting this weird crossover. Should be a gap there. I'm gonna hide the I'm just gonna hide the overflow here. And if I save that, there you go. That looks right. Yeah. That looks like more what I'm trying to create here. Okay, so that about concludes the tutorial on what's been definitely a more advanced and in-depth look at the framework. But in this tutorial, we've already covered quite a lot. So I've actually introduced you to not only setting up a project using Angular's CLI, and of course terminal and npm. I've also shown you how to manipulate an API within the framework. And in this example, I've shown you how to output images from obviously through an API. And it's actually fully responsive because we've also incorporated Bootstrap. So if I shrink this down, it goes into a one-column layout. Before I end this video tutorial, I just want to take the chance to encourage you to visit our official website, siteeasy.com. Here we provide a range of different products and services, including a complete pre-built e-commerce and social networking platform that you can use to create content management, e-commerce, and social networking websites. We have an online demo for you to preview. We also offer a range of different scripts, including a user registration system. If you enjoyed our tutorial, then please check out our official website, simpletut.com, where we post all of our free resources and training videos, including this one, and it is a great resource for you to use to search our growing library of tutorials. If you are interested in receiving updates, then please like our Facebook page, and again, there will be a link to all of these websites and pages in the description of this video, but we'll obviously post regular updates about new resources and freebies that become available to you. And finally, the final thing that I'd like to encourage you to do is encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like and comment on this video itself, but I'll also be posting links, as I referenced in the earlier parts of this tutorial, to the first video in this series on Angular, but also to a recent tutorial we released on React.js, which is probably Angular's biggest competitor at the moment in terms of a front-end framework. But if you are interested in getting into the industry and working particularly on front-end web development, then React and Angular are definitely very vital skills for you to acquire, as there is just a growing demand for Angular and React developers in the industry right now. Once again, thank you very much for following this video tutorial, and I look forward to the next one.